那我们开始哦。Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Wu Jialing from the Department of Sociology at National Taiwan University, and it's my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Sara Friedman. Professor Friedman is a professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Gender Studies program at the Indiana University in the United States. Her research examines the intersection between intimate life and political and legal domains in Taiwan and China. She's the author or co-editor of 4 books. Most recently, the book titled Exceptional States, Chinese Immigrants and Taiwanese Sovereignty, published by the University of California Press. Her current research focuses on family making among LGBTQ people in Taiwan. She's also teaching queer families in global perspective in our department this semester. I believe some of the students are here today. Can you raise your hands? Students, okay, you are very much welcome to the sociology building because you have been teaching in the next building, right? This is your home, okay? Right. And Professor Friedman is currently president-elect of the Society for East Asian Anthropology of the American Anthropological Association. President Friedman. This is a remarkable achievement and a testament to her outstanding contributions to the field, and we are truly honored to have her with us today. Although Professor Friedman speaks excellent Mandarin, today's talk will be delivered in English first, and the Q&A section can be bilingual. The presentation will be about 1 hour, followed by an open discussion. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Sara Friedman.
Thank you. For ease of doing the slides, I think I'm going to sit, but can everybody see me and hear me okay? Okay, great. First of all, I want to thank Professor Wu for that generous introduction and for everything she has done to support my time here at NTU. I'm very grateful. And I also want to thank Conan, who has assisted in, I can't tell you how many ways. So it would not be possible without all of his work. So before I begin my talk, I want to map out a little bit my research trajectory, how I've come to this topic. And I began around the time of the 2017 Constitutional Court decision. Sorry, I'm just going to time myself so I don't go over. To think about how there was emerging in Taiwan a changing imagination around queer family and how individuals who did not want to enter heterosexual marriage and family making were creating families of their own. And what were some of the changing possibilities, legal, technological, social, for achieving those goals? And so a significant part of the research that I did between 2017 and 2024 looked at what that changing legal terrain looked like and what kinds of activism was emerging to push for areas that had not been addressed in existing law to date. What I want to talk about today is focusing on one piece of those activist efforts and legal reforms, and that is in regards to assisted reproductive technology access in Taiwan. And I'm going to foreground this concept of access, and I'll talk about that more in a minute, and how we can use assisted reproductive technologies, or ARTs, as I will call them, as one way of thinking about the nexus of family, gender, and nation. So I'm going to have 3 foci in the talk today. One is the concept of demographic anxieties. The other is reproductive citizenship, And then I will, at the end, gesture toward how we might think about possible kinship futures in Taiwan and elsewhere. So, demographic anxieties. This is a term that reflects our current moment in the world globally. Right? There are a broad range of concerns that are encapsulated under this theme of demographic anxieties: below replacement birth rates, a rising proportion of elderly, cross-border migration flows, food insecurity, and also the ongoing threat of environmental and climate disasters. Demographic anxieties are not natural or given, but they reflect how specific reproductive and population phenomena get defined as a problem to be addressed through what Desordo and her colleagues call forms of reproductive governance or mechanisms of reproductive governance. So this formulation calls into being a model of human collectivity called population, and it also presumes the presence of a state entity to manage and respond to the changing shape of that population, to maximize those human resources. Now, as the attention to fertility, and especially this idea of a looming fertility cliff in the global population, gets more and more attention, we see concerns shifting from what we might call anti-natalist policies, efforts to control the number of children being born, to pro-natalist policies, encouraging higher rates of childbirth. And I want to suggest that this focus on fertility is a really powerful nexus point that links authoritative forms of knowledge to social norms and to various kinds of political projects that create what we might think of as hierarchies of reproductive value, or what Colin called stratified reproduction. So I'm going to be talking today about whose reproductive desires are recognized, acknowledged, supported, and whose are not, and for what reasons. And there's a variety of different angles we could take in asking these questions. Some have approached it from an expansive reproductive justice perspective that takes into account not only who can create families, but through what means, what are the diverse forms of caregiving that exist that might involve non-reproductive or non-marital relationships as well as those who advocate for more what we might think of as traditional two-parent, opposite-sex-led families. The actors in these debates certainly vary across national contexts. But the debates generally center on a shared set of questions that I list here. What constitutes a family? Who's recognized as a parent? What pathways are available or should be made available to create family, whether through bringing children into one's life or in other mechanisms? How to better support caregiving for all, and how to encourage both reproductive and non-reproductive kinship futures. Assisted reproductive technologies and queer family making have occupy, I think, what's fair to say, a somewhat contested space in these demographic conversations. On the one hand, ARTs risk prioritizing biological reproduction. Some argue that they promote compulsory motherhood, and that when combined with queer family making, ARTs can sometimes marginalize alternative ways of making kin. In my talk today, I want to engage these conversations by examining queer family formation in Taiwan and some of the ongoing debates about access to assisted reproductive technologies. So I'm going to ask how these debates foreground the question of who is considered a legitimate reproducer in Taiwan, which fertility figures occupy center stage and why. And I'm going to foreground this concept of access, as in how debates about reproductive citizenship center around who is able to use ARTs, what ARTs are available in a given context, and how this idea of access actually moves people and technologies across different kinds of borders that are defined by law, ethics, embodiment, desire, as well as diverse forms of recognition or non-recognition. Access discussions are often rife with what we might call techno-optimism, i.e. you give them access to ART and they will use it successfully. And they sometimes reaffirm both hetero and homonormative models of family and national belonging. Access is less controversial when it's seen as direct, meaning that an intending parent with a uterus is available to utilize ARTs to conceive. And it's more controversial when it is seen as indirect, meaning it is rooted through a third party, whether because of the need for donor gametes, like sperm and egg, or the need for a third party individual to carry a pregnancy and give birth, as with surrogacy. And I'll talk a little bit about how those debates play out in the Taiwan case. So ultimately, I'm interested in what these debates about ART access show us about possibilities for rethinking how we understand parentage, who can be and is recognized as a legitimate parent, and how legitimacy itself might reflect gendered and sexual norms of caregiving and mutual support. And then I ultimately will ask how we move from these debates to think more expansively about making kin in ways that don't necessarily reduce queer kinship to demographic anxieties in their current form. So a concept I'm going to use is this idea of reproductive citizenship that has a very long genealogy in many fields that aim to unpack this idea of an ostensibly universal citizen at the heart, especially of liberal democracies, but there's work that looks at it in authoritarian states as well. One of the major threads in this scholarship is elucidating some of the inequalities around gendered citizenship. So the unrecognized labor of women who reproduce citizens, and the foundational status of the married reproductive heterosexual couple as the core of citizenship. This is obviously a vast literature. I can't do justice to it here, but I want to pull out 3 broad insights that will help me organize my analysis. One is the need to question what lies behind the ostensibly neutral generic categories such as citizen, or for that matter, state, woman, and population. And second is to interrogate the presumed equation of good citizen with reproductive citizen, and all of the assumptions that go with that around normative sexuality, gender, and family. And then third is to ask how ARTs, assisted reproductive technologies, that are ostensibly the product of scientific rationality and generalizability, how they take culturally and nationally specific forms as they are integrated into national population projects. So reproductive studies scholars have described ARTs such as IVF, or in vitro fertilization, as a form of hope technology, to use Sarah Franklin's term, for infertile individuals and couples who desire a genetically related child. But they also show how IVF and other ARTs work as a technology of social contract, one that creates and reaffirms a form of belonging to a national body and its continuity over time. And this contract can be empowering or constraining depending on how individual citizens are positioned in relation to a heteronormative ideal at the heart of citizenship. So, for instance, there are consequences for those who choose not to reproduce, for those who find themselves unable to do so or unable to do so in a desired way. And we might ask then how differently positioned intending parents claim or seek access to ARTs by identifying themselves as citizens who are deserving of rights and recognition. This approach builds on a body of scholarship, much of it actually interestingly based in Europe. I'm not sure if that's specific to something about European liberal democracies or not, but that really shows how discussions around access to ART become part of discussions around nation building and national inclusion and reproduction, especially national reproduction. So in this kind of work, we see reproductive citizenship emerging as both a kind of top-down moral legal construct and as a bottom-up form of self-fashioning that affirms national community belonging and national reproduction together with the sometimes incoherent workings of state reproductive power. So in these debates, I think we can foreground questions such as whose reproduction is supported or encouraged, what kinds of family structures are deemed desirable, or at the very least, less likely to cause so-called social problems. And I think in asking these questions, we need to pay attention to both the compulsory side of reproductive citizenship and its generative possibilities, both for state demographic goals and for diverse groups who are seeking different forms of parenthood and family recognition. So let's turn to reproductive citizenship in Taiwan, right? This is an image that I think many of you are familiar with. Taiwan's demographic trends certainly resemble many of its regional neighbors in transitioning in a very compressed time frame from concerns about populations that are growing too quickly through effective family planning, or in the case, for instance, of China, state-led population control policies, to the current moment where we see growing anxieties about rapidly declining rates of heterosexual marriage and childbearing. So the below replacement trajectory that I assume we're all familiar with is something that is assumed to be applicable across societies, and that it reflects a similar concern with what happens when you drop below that magic number of 2.1. I want to suggest that in Taiwan there are additional concerns that manifest in these discussions that circulate around the magic 2.1 figure. So in addition to ultra-low birth rates, rapid population aging, concerns about immigration and immigration regulation, we also see how population gets linked to national security concerns about both weakening military strength and overall resources and the resource base as Taiwan faces the potential threat of invasion from China. So in this moment of searching for effective inducements to pull the country out of its current below 1.0 total fertility rate, there is a sense that this is an existential crisis, right? And these are just a few headlines. You can find many more that match these themes in the current press and otherwise. So some of these concerns would mirror those you see in South Korea and Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, China. But obviously there are other ones that emerge that are more specific to Taiwan's contested sovereignty. And that's something I'm not going to talk very much about today, but it is a theme in my research about how that particular anxiety reemerges in domains that we wouldn't think of as connected to national security specifically. And I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A as well. Okay, so Taiwan also differs from its regional neighbors in its more liberal stance regarding gender and sexual orientation. And I'm going to assume that this is familiar to everyone, but I'll do a quick recap. So obviously in May 2019, Taiwan became the first country in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage, and we have people present who were very active in drafting the law and activism around what I'm calling here the 748 Act for ease of wording. So what did the act make possible, and what did it initially not make possible, right? So we have the recognition of a kind of marriage if you meet certain conditions, although it wasn't called marriage in the law, and the granting of some of the marriage rights that heterosexual couples enjoy. But the law did something that the Constitutional Court interpretation did not do, right? So it went one step beyond in recognizing a form of co-parental rights for same-sex married couples where one partner had a so-called birth child or biological child. And it created a mechanism for the other parent to do a form of step-parent adoption to secure parental rights vis-a-vis that child. So it opened up this possibility that if you could marry and one of you had a child biogenetically related to you, you could create a co-parental family unit that had a legal status. Okay. So that was a big step. The Constitutional Court decision did not mention children at all. It only dealt with the relationship between two adults and that intimate partner relationship. So what did the act initially, at least, not make possible? It did not open up marriage registration for all binational couples, right? It depended on what country the non-Taiwanese partner hailed from. There have been gradual expansions in that in 2023 and 2024, but there are still exceptions for cross-strait couples, China-Taiwan couples. It did not initially allow same-sex spouses to jointly adopt a non-related child, even though joint adoption was mandated for heterosexual spouses. And that was only revised in 2023. And what we're talking about today, it did nothing to change the Assisted Reproductive Technology Act that defined legal users as heterosexual married couples, right? So it did not grant access to ARTs. So it is this law, the 2007 ART Act, that is the kind of center of attention and legal reform activism at our current moment. The act restricts access to assisted reproductive technologies to married husband and wife with proven infertility, right? And then there are other constraints many of you, especially Jialing, are very familiar with. The wife must be able to carry the pregnancy, so this is surrogacy is not legalized. They can only use one set of donor gametes, so the child has to have a biogenetic relationship to at least one parent. And there are no commercial gamete sales, right? It has to be altruistic donation and simply covering the costs incurred. So the ART Act has what many reproductive studies scholars call a conjugal confine, meaning it restricts childbearing to the marital relationship. And that's preserving this marriage childbearing link. That is something that is being debated more now. And it ignores other forms of so-called non-medical infertility, whether we want to term that social infertility or structural infertility, a more pervasive form of infertility where law, social norms, as well as biology come into play. So in the current debates about expanding access to reproductive technologies, there are a couple of different actors who make their appearance on the scene. Single women, unmarried women are one, married lesbian couples, unmarried heterosexual partners who could, if they were included, use the male partner's sperm to conceive, and then married gay couples who would require assistance from a gestational surrogate. So surrogacy would have to be legalized. So these are the groups that are coming into the conversation here. So what I want to draw on to talk about these current debates is building on ethnographic research that I've been doing on queer family formation in Taiwan since 2017. And this includes, just to briefly situate you, more than 70 interviews with queer parents, roughly 2/3 of whom identify as lesbian mothers, 1/3 as gay fathers, and who use various forms of family building strategies to create their families. Some use transnational ART use with different destination countries by what kinds of ART treatments they need and their resources. Some intending mothers conceive domestically through self-insemination with sperm from a known donor. Some engage in contractual marriages, so a lesbian woman marries a gay man so they can get access to ART in Taiwan and conceive that way. And some use more informal conception arrangements. I'm happy to talk about those. Others have adopted domestically, initially as a single parent, and then since 2023 jointly together. And some conceive in a prior heterosexual marriage. So the research involved interviews as well as participation in queer family social gatherings and other kinds of interactions, and also work with relevant NGOs and legal advocacy groups. And this ranged from attending information sessions to meeting with social workers, to attending street protests and court cases, et cetera. So to get the sense of that broader landscape. And in 2026, this year, since I've been in Taiwan, I've also started interviewing relevant stakeholders in the ART debates. So including fertility medicine professionals, LGBTQ rights and feminist advocacy groups, and intending queer parents. So people who are thinking about having children but haven't yet embarked or are in the middle of it, but very much attuned to how the law might change. So I want to talk a little bit about public discourse surrounding proposed revisions of the Act, as well as some of the initial findings from my interviews so far. And I will also draw from this previous research foundation to talk about what I've learned about the reproductive aspirations of queer parents and how they've tried to realize these goals or aim to achieve them in ways that they deem feasible, ethical, and socially recognized. Now, I do want to say that there is a strong desire for biogenetic children among Taiwanese queer parents and intending parents. But at the same time, the need for donor gametes and the reliance on ARTs and informal conception strategies also create more flexible approaches to how we might think about blood, biokin, and family belonging and caregiving. So how one evaluates biological and social kinship actually matters here. And I'll just give you one example, out of the 50 or so lesbian mothers I interviewed, only 11 conceived at least one child through self-insemination. Even though self-insemination is much less invasive, it's virtually free, right? Very minimal costs, and easy to do within the context of Taiwan. By contrast, 24 conceived one or more children through pursuing ARTs abroad and using sperm purchased from an international sperm bank. So when I asked them why they chose the expensive, time-consuming, and physically demanding path of transnational ART, many mothers expressed concern about legal and social complications from informal conception at home, including potential paternity claims. But many also expressed their commitment to sharing motherhood across both parents, something that's only possible through IVF, using what they call a form of reciprocal IVF, or 'A卵必生 in Chinese. So one partner contributes the egg that is used to create an embryo with donor sperm, and the embryo is implanted in the other partner who carries the pregnancy and gives birth. So you have a kind of shared genetic and gestational roles. Among gay fathers, too, pursuing IRTs, there's in some cases also the desire to share paternity through mixing their sperm or anonymizing whose embryos are implanted in a surrogate. A more ultimately symbolic expression of shared paternity, just for legal reasons. They usually have to know who the genetic father is at some point. But they use ARTs in ways that certainly support biogenetic models of kinship, but they also enable practices that diversify what biology or blood actually means in queer families. So by 2024, if we are coming closer to the present, it really looked as if Taiwan's legislature might finally revise the ART Act, especially as demographic anxieties took center stage in that year's legislative and presidential elections. But unfortunately, ART access stalled after that for reasons I think you're all very familiar with. The legislature got drawn into its own internal dramas, as well as the legislative recall movement in 2025. So it was only this past December that the Executive Yuan finally issued its own draft version of the law, and the Legislative Yuan held its first committee debate on that draft in January 2026, together with more than roughly somewhere in the 15 to 20 range drafts from individual legislators. So whether this draft is actually going to proceed in the legislature in this session, I think is still unclear. So my discussion is a little bit prospective in orientation, right? I'm looking ahead to the possibility of future legal reforms with an eye to both longstanding demographic trends and how they position queer parents, especially as out of step with their heterosexual counterparts who are increasingly opting out of marriage or childbearing. Okay, so as a preliminary venture, I want to just talk briefly about 3 public hearings that were held in 2024, 2 organized by the Ministry of Health and Welfare, and 1 held in the Legislative Yuan Social Welfare and Environmental Hygiene Committee. And these public hearings brought together a number of stakeholder groups, as you see here listed on the left, from NGOs to legislators, medical experts, academics, Professor Wu testified, as well as certain relevant citizens. And there are a number of issues that come up in these debates that I've summarized very briefly here on the right. There's a lot more that gets covered, but I'm not going to have time to go into the details. Which user groups should be given access to ARTs? What kinds of ARTs should be available in Taiwan? So should surrogacy be legalized? What kinds of ground rules should be established for collecting and sharing information about gamete donors? And how does that relate to rights of children conceived through ART to know their origins? Okay, so that's just in a very, very briefly summarizing kind of complex terrain. Okay, so in these debates, we see a series of concerns and topics that can be grouped, roughly speaking, under demographic anxieties on the one hand, and equal rights and protections on the other. So the question of Taiwan's own demographic crisis, we could say, erupts again and again. And this anxiety cuts across party lines, it cuts across political orientations, right? This notion that ART access expansion will help redress Taiwan's fertility decline. Whether it will or not is another question, but that's certainly a thread that runs through these debates. At the same time, there are counter voices that advocate what we might call, following Karis Thompson's work, selective pronatalism, meaning we should encourage childbearing by some groups, but not others, right? So for instance, more conservative voices, organizations that espouse traditional heterosexual two-parent family model, organizations that are opposed to abortion, for instance, tend to not advocate expanding access to queer individuals, to single women, or to unmarried heterosexual couples. And again, these are positions that are going to cut across different political, otherwise what might be seen as political orientations. There's also, again, cross-party framing of declining fertility as a national security concern, and therefore advocating an expansion of access beyond the heteronorm to include queer intending parents and single women, okay? And for single women especially, there's this notion of a ticking biological clock that is reiterated again and again by different speakers. So advocating revising the law quickly to grant access to groups who these speakers identify as uncontroversial ART users, right? There are, again, here two opposing voices that contest the assumption that single women and lesbian couples are uncontroversial reproductive citizens, and I'm happy to provide some of that information. In these conversations, there is a return to the assumed link between marriage and childbearing, right? So for some speakers, this is a link that should be preserved as a way of promoting stable society and ensuring the well-being of children. In others, this is something that is out of date and does not reflect the growing population of women in the, say, 30 to 34 age range who desire to have children but aren't married, right? And so as one legislator put it, must we force them to enter marriage to have a child? On the equal protection, anti-discrimination side, these debates also center a reproductive citizen who benefits from both marriage equality and equal access to reproductive rights and protections. So eliminating unequal treatment on the basis of sexual orientation and marital status at the same time. The idea that a certain cohort of the population is being treated as a second-class citizen because they're denied access to Taiwan's widely recognized successful fertility medicine sector is another theme that emerges, and there's testimony from women who were went abroad to pursue ARTs and the physical, emotional, psychological costs that went with that. There's also a emergence of a paternalistic state message in these debates, and that appears much more clearly in the Executive UN draft from December 2025, that single women are a higher risk in the sense that they will be subject to heightened scrutiny about their suitability for pursuing ART, what is their support network, and then also wanting to follow them post-pregnancy and birth to make sure that the child is well supported. As part of that orientation, the 2025 draft actually puts in citizenship requirements for single women that are not in place for any of the married couples. So not only do they have to be Taiwanese citizens, but they have to have household registration in Taiwan, and they have to have lived in Taiwan for more than 183 days over each year over the past 5 years. So there's a very much of a paternalistic state that is emerging in this formulation. And then finally, there's cautionary wording from women's groups and feminist groups that the expansion of ART access is further reaffirming the connection between women and childbearing and reproduction of the national population. And that emerges in a number of ways, the emphasis on blood and biological kin to continue the patriline, concerns with challenging compulsory motherhood. So these all make their reappearance in these debates. And then there's something that I think of as techno-legal effects and techno-optimism. And this is something that I'm just starting to think about from the interviews that I've been doing. One is the normativity effects of a technology-centered approach to assisted reproductive technology. How the focus on technology reaffirms binary gender and gender identification through the focus on bodily processes that are part of ARTs, and then how that is also tied to different kinds of legal categories. So if you look at the language of the 2025 Executive UN draft, there's some strange language about how it characterizes married lesbian couples as opposed to married heterosexual couples that emerges from the different roots of those marital statuses in the Civil Code as opposed to the 748 Act. There is also interesting legal categorization around children who result from ART as being marital children, even when born to a single unmarried woman, language that is intended to prevent paternity claims from sperm donors, but that could have reverberating effects in other domains of seeking co-parental rights for same-sex parents. So this is, again, preliminary thinking, and I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. There's also the techno-optimism approach, which says if you provide access, they will come, they will use it. And from my interviews, especially with intending lesbian mothers, there's some interesting different perspective. The concern about what one can know about a donor in advance is something that those who are familiar with international sperm banks and the wide array of information that one receives if one is willing to pay the price, sometimes balk at the limited information they will have about sperm donors in Taiwan. And there's also, together with that, a kind of fear of nearness that somehow, even with this limited information, a donor could come looking for a child later in life and make demands on that child for care or money or something else. And then on the other hand, there's also concerns about what the child would be able to know about its origins because of limited information from donors. So this is really mutually, internally contradictory perspectives. There's not a clear line of inquiry, but I think it shows that simply opening up access isn't necessarily going to make everyone come flocking. Some will still choose to go abroad if they can afford it, because they feel it gives them greater choice and greater protections. And then on the ticking biological clock, I do think this is a salient issue for many, especially women who are getting older. And I include here some quotes from a woman I'm calling Amy, a 37-year-old professional who's in a 15-year relationship with her high school classmate, who's gone through the process of egg retrieval and freezing her eggs in Taiwan. A very arduous process because she had low egg reserves unexpectedly, and that cost much more than they had originally budgeted for, meaning that they now have to wait another year or so before they have the resources to then ship those eggs to the US to create embryos to begin the process of trying to actually conceive a child. If they could do that in Taiwan, it would happen much faster. They wouldn't necessarily have had to freeze eggs. They could have gone directly to creating embryos, which are more stable. There's a whole set of things that would have been different. So for someone like Amy, legal reform is a really pressing issue, as they are, as she put it, racing against the clock, racing against time, racing against age. And she underscores the irony of concerns in Taiwan about low fertility rates, precisely because she sees herself as part of a group of women who do want to have children but are not being allowed to do so. Okay, I want to turn at the end of my talk here to also thinking about surrogacy, which is certainly a more contested issues. And one of the things that struck me in looking at the public hearings from 2024 is the comparative absence of discussions regarding gay fatherhood in the debates around surrogacy. We see more prominently is the figure of the suffering woman who either doesn't have a uterus or is unable to support a pregnancy. That is the fertility figure who is constantly being invoked in these debates around surrogacy. Gay men are a kind of absent presence, especially when the discussion turns to questions around the potential exploitation of women's bodies, commodification of women's bodies. So how do we think about men, both in surrogacy debates, but also in these population demography debates more generally? If we foreground reproductive citizenship, might we then have a clearer understanding of how parental desires are distributed across gender identification, sexual orientation, and embodiment as well? So gay men's reliance on gestational surrogacy and women's reproductive labor is a difficult, and it's often an uncomfortable topic for many of my research interlocutors. And I think the absence of gay men in the public hearing debates speaks volumes about this discomfort. Queer family advocacy groups often find themselves in a difficult position here. They're wedged between their support for diverse families and diverse pathways to family formation and their own gender equity commitments and alliances with feminist groups who are deeply concerned that legalizing surrogacy will further exploit women, commodify their bodies and reproductive capacities. So we see here often some what I think of as strange bedfellow alliances emerging. Feminists aligned with conservative groups in opposition to surrogacy, despite their otherwise divergent positions on women's and queer rights, divorce, singlehood, abortion, or same-sex marriage. So we see here a kind of risk associated with coalitional politics. And this is not something I'm going into, but I think it's important to mention, right? Both in terms of a presumably coherent queer politics that aligns feminist, gay, lesbian, queer, and trans orientations, and that we've already seen emerging in a very contested way, and also an assumedly shared understanding of what the subject position woman stands for, especially as a focal point for reproductive rights and justice initiatives. So I think probably most of you are familiar with the fact that surrogacy was included in a very early draft from the Ministry of Health and Welfare in 2024. But then at the end of 2024, the ministry announced that it was separating surrogacy from the rest of the law. It was too controversial. It would be dealt with separately. And in fact, the executive UN draft issued this past December does not address surrogacy at all. So it is this third-party relationship, I think, that becomes the focus of concern in how to imagine surrogacy as equitable, protected, non-exploitative. And I want to briefly discuss how that third-party reproductive scenario emerged in a social media debate that happened in early 2025. And I want to talk about two posts by gay fathers who conceived through gestational surrogacy in the US. The first is an early March Threads post by a gay father who details his and his husband's long journey through multiple failed attempts to conceive. The father who writes the post, I'll call A, describes 3 years of flying back and forth to the US, 5 IVF cycles, 2 implantation failures, 2 miscarriages, and only a successful pregnancy on the 5th try. He talks about the emotional roller coaster he experienced during this time and the torment of the surrogacy process for him, unable to eat or sleep well, crying for days after each failed pregnancy. Only at the end of the post does A thank their friends and family members who supported them through the process, and then finally he thanks their surrogate who made it possible for them to have their son. Set off from the rest of the text in this blue at the bottom is a culminating sentence that obliquely responds to critiques of surrogacy as the exploitation of women's bodies. And you see here where A says, I'm open to congratulations, but I don't want to hear you instruct me on how a uterus should be used. If you're uncomfortable, then scram. Harsh words, certainly, arrogant words, as many say, that contrast sharply with the photos he posts below the post of his son, one with the 2 fathers and the other with the child in the car seat with their household cat looking on. So as one might expect, there was a torrent of online criticism in response to this post. The arrogant tone affirmed for many the risks inherent in commodifying women's bodies and the potential for exploitation that would follow. There were many perceptive critiques of the narrative style of the post, particularly how A's writing disappeared both the agency and the voice of the egg donor and the surrogates. Again, there were multiple. Others saw A claiming the physical labor of pregnancy for himself, and again, erasing the surrogate's actual labor through pregnancy and childbirth. All A did was spend money, one respondent argued, and others described him as outsourcing the risk of pregnancy while assuming the status of mother. In a gender-bending twist, A asserts, "From now on, I am determined to become the world's most handsome, most beautiful mother." A few weeks, or shortly thereafter, also in March, another gay father posted on Facebook to counteract the image and the debate circling around A's post. His post conveyed in more sensitive detail how he and his husband established a bond with their surrogate L, communicated regularly with her throughout the pregnancy, how all three of them shared a commitment to continuing their alternative kinship ties into the future, with L identifying herself as the child's U.S. mother and L's mother referring to herself as his U.S. grandma. The author here is clearly intending to provide a counterexample, offering a more mutually respectful and supportive surrogacy relationship, which he contends is more the norm among Taiwanese gay fathers. Nonetheless, he also acknowledges that at the heart of this debate lies both ongoing gender inequality in Taiwan and also men's pervasive ignorance of women's bodies and their embodied reproductive experiences. The critiques here are similar to those in response to A's post, that the author was merely a good consumer in a bad system, so it was still a commodified system, that he was usurping the surrogate's labor, and this is specifically in reference to the photo of a skin-to-skin bonding in the immediate period after the child's birth, which is now an established childbirth practice to help the infant bond with its primary caregivers. And also how surrogacy in general reaffirms patrilineal norms around continuing the family patriline and the value of blood in doing that. I do think there are other messages that come through, and that in a subsequent interview that I was able to conduct with the author also emerged around this idea of what are the parental roles that are available to gay men, and who is understood as having access to motherhood or mothering as a practice in Taiwan. So that gay fathers' own parental recognition, whether social or legal, is much more fraught than for lesbian mothers. And these are just some of the themes that came up. The fact that gay men who want to have a child face the so-called original sin of lacking a uterus, and also the lack of non-binary terms of address for gay fathers. There's less gender flexibility in this regard that also then extends to the heightened attention to how they parent and whether they parent well, we might say. Okay, so I want to just also briefly provide one more example that came from a podcast this past year from the NGO Taiwan LGBT Family Rights Advocacy, in which a gay father makes a second appearance on the podcast to reflect on a visit that he and his husband and their child paid to their surrogate in the US. And because of delays caused by the pandemic, their trip was delayed, but they had maintained contact remotely, meeting over video chat, sending gifts, etc. In his account of the visit, this father, who I call Joe here, is really clearly moved by their experiences, by their warm welcome by the surrogate he calls Emma, and her extended family members as well. And at the end of the podcast episode, he reads from a letter that he sent to Emma after the visit, and I excerpt a section here. where he says, "We remember saying goodbye to you in 2017 as we traveled with our son to Denver to prepare leaving the US. Since then, our two families have entered different life stages. Our son opened up a beautiful, unexpected chapter in our lives, and we've never forgotten that these happy life experiences all originate from your help. Without you, such dreams that far exceeded our expectations would never have been realized. We are forever grateful to you." In a text message, Emma once referred to us as her, quote, "very own extended family forever." We are deeply honored. Although we're separated by long distances, we're deeply thankful and proud to be members of your warm, kind, and beautiful family. So Joe's letter obviously could not be more different from A's thread post. It perhaps comes closer to what the author of the second post aims for in his portrayal of their surrogacy experience. There's obviously a lot to be unpacked here in terms of who has the resources to travel to the US, whether surrogates are interested in maintaining contact, who has the language skills, even with AI and translation, to maintain these ties. So I by no means intend to present an idealistic picture here, but simply to gesture towards some of the possibilities of alternative kin-making that are opened up by surrogacy, and the possibility of making kin while also making population. So Joe's son here is the focal point in a new web of family relationships that are made possible both by Emma's reproductive labor and a commitment to being kin that is untethered from blood's ties. So I don't want to naively say that this is the future of kinship in any way, but that surrogacy also does potentially open up with goodwill and resources and a host of protections, regulations, and support structures that in current legal formation have yet to be guaranteed, but that are certainly possible. So to conclude, all we have to do is look at the news to see stories that circulate about new scientific discoveries that promote the future of techno-optimism in terms of human reproductive capacities, right? As I was writing an early version of this paper, there was one story about creating embryos from human skin cells and therefore being able potentially in the future to allow two same-sex individuals to conceive a child that shares both of their biogenetic material, right? So I think we have to keep this techno-optimism in mind at the same time that we return to critiques of demographic rationality and its various modes of governance in response to demographic anxieties. So there are questions about where conception quests end or should end, and when the rational utility of ever expanding techno-innovation is going to meet both its moral and legal limits. There is, in some ways, an unbreachable gap between macro-level commitments that define people as a collective good and individual, community, and state aspirations to create families through conceiving children. So who will or can have these babies who are so desired, both by individual parents and by states, population experts, officials, remains an open question given the many debates that I've analyzed today. There is also a tendency to discuss reproductive politics in juridical terms, especially given the power of law to regulate access to ARTs and to determine who controls their own rights to reproduce and not to reproduce. But the moral, political, and social worlds that are created around and through law are also rife with contention, especially when reproductive citizenship is at stake. Citizens and non-citizens may be pitted against one another. Supreme Court in the US talking about that right now, right? Arrayed unequally with respect to both bodily autonomy and reproductive capacities on the one hand, and desires to create and diversify families on the other. The debates that I've talked about today do not resolve such conflicts by any means, but they elucidate some of the fault lines that we can trace to begin envisioning different kinship futures. As Judith Butler cautioned more than 20 years ago, we should be alert to the various permutations of exclusion, legitimation, recognizability or non-recognizability that emerge when we, quote, as she put it, desire the state's desire, or in my words, when we ratify normative frames for thinking and creating kinship. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay. And I believe you will have a lot of questions to ask Sarah or comments. So now we have 30 minutes for discussion. Maybe we'll collect a few questions and Sarah will respond to those questions. Any questions from the audience?